In the stillness of night, when the world lies wrapped in silence, there are places whose names are scarcely spoken aloud. Places where stone and iron seem to carry memories of human suffering, where shadows linger even when the torches are long extinguished. Among such places stands a prison so infamous, so deeply soaked in sorrow, that even its keepers, the very men entrusted to control it, could not endure its weight without losing themselves. This is not simply the tale of a prison. It is the story of a wound carved into the human spirit, where walls were not mere barriers of stone, but instruments of despair. Imagine yourself approaching its gates for the first time. The night air is heavy, still damp with the scent of earth and decay. A narrow road leads you forward, lined with looming walls that seem to rise higher the closer you draw. The stones are dark, pitted, and uneven, as if they too have been scarred by centuries of anguish. Iron spikes jut upward, catching the faintest light of the moon, gleaming like teeth in the maw of some great beast. Even before you set foot within, you can sense that this is not a place built merely to confine, it is a place that swallows hope whole. History does not always remember places like these with precision. Records fade, names are lost, and yet the whispers endure. For those who once entered here, the memory was not easily erased. The cries of prisoners carried beyond the walls, floating into nearby villages, becoming fuel for rumor and fear. Mothers would hush their children by speaking the prison's name, warning that misbehavior could send them into those endless halls. Travelers gave the place a wide berth, unwilling to linger near a structure so closely tied with cruelty and death. It was said that even the guards, hardened men chosen for their ability to enforce order, would leave their shifts pale and shaken. Some lasted only weeks before resigning, unable to bear the ceaseless cries echoing through corridors at night. Others stayed, but something in them shifted. Their eyes grew hollow, their tempers short, their laughter absent. The darkness they once controlled began to seep into their own minds. Over time, stories circulated of wardens who went mad, convinced that they could hear footsteps when the halls were empty, or whispers in the dead of night speaking their names. The prison did not simply house madness, it bred it. For those who crossed the threshold as inmates, the experience was far worse. Imagine the sound of the great gate clanging shut behind you. The air inside is colder, more suffocating, as if the walls themselves squeeze the life from you. Each step deeper into its belly feels heavier, as though your chains grow thicker with every turn. The silence is oppressive, broken only by the distant scrape of boots or the occasional rattle of keys. And then, faintly, from some unseen corner, a voice cries out in despair, a sound that tells you you are not alone, and yet utterly abandoned. The prison earned its reputation not only from the cruelty inflicted within its walls, but from the way it seemed to erode the very sense of time and identity. Day and night blurred together in the suffocating gloom. Sunlight rarely pierced its interior. Prisoners learned to measure the passage of hours not by the cycle of the sky, but by the shuffling of guards and the thin meals that arrived like clockwork. In such conditions, the human mind wavered. Men forgot the sound of their own voices. Women clutched scraps of fabric as though they were sacred relics. The living and the broken walked side by side, indistinguishable until one collapsed into silence. Legends claim that the very stones of the place absorbed the anguish of generations. Step into certain corridors, they said, and you would feel a chill not born of weather, but of something lingering, watching. Some guards swore they heard chains rattling in empty cells, doors creaking open without touch, or faint singing from chambers that had long been sealed. Whether truth or imagination, such tales were enough to blur the line between reality and nightmare. In time, even the most skeptical admitted that there was something about the prison that defied explanation. But the prison was not built for ghosts or for legends. It was built for control. Those in power designed it as a tool, a statement of authority carved in stone. It was meant to break men down, to crush rebellion, to serve as a warning to all who dared to challenge the order of things. And yet, in the attempt to create the perfect machine of fear, they inadvertently created a place that turned on its masters. The cruelty meant to silence dissent instead echoed outward, tarnishing reputations, haunting communities, and spreading dread far beyond its walls. Tonight, as you listen, let yourself drift back to that time. Hear the heavy footsteps of guards patrolling the halls, their torches flickering against damp stone. Hear the muffled cries that rise and fade, carrying the grief of hundreds. Smell the staleness of air that has long since ceased to feel fresh. Let the cold seep into your bones as you picture those endless corridors stretching ahead, each doorway a passage into another life broken, another story left unfinished. This first whisper is not the full story, but the opening of a long, winding path. In the chapters that follow, we will walk slowly through this forgotten prison, uncovering how it came to be, what lives it swallowed, and why even those who once held power within its walls could not escape its grip. You will see not only stone and iron, but the faces of those who endured, and the shadows of those who did not. You will feel the rise and fall of hope and despair, the delicate balance between survival and surrender. The prison may be silent now, its gates rusted, its halls empty. But through memory, it still breathes. And as we begin this journey together, let us step carefully into its darkness, not with fear, but with the calm knowledge that in remembering, we honor those who were lost within. This is the story of a prison so horrific that even its guards went mad, and though the stones may crumble, its echoes remain eternal. Every prison is born of fear. Fear of disorder, fear of rebellion, fear of losing control. To understand how this monstrous place came into being, we must step back into the world that gave it life, a world teetering between order and chaos, where rulers believed that the strength of their authority could only be measured by the harshness of their punishments. The era was one of turbulence. Cities swelled with new life, trade routes thrived, and populations grew restless under the weight of shifting economies and changing powers. The ruling class, whether king, council, or empire, watched uneasily as crime seemed to rise with every passing year. But crime in this age was a broad word, encompassing not only theft and violence but also dissent, protest, and the faintest whisper of resistance. A man who questioned a tax could be branded a troublemaker. A woman accused of harboring forbidden beliefs could find herself condemned. Justice was rarely blind. It tilted heavily toward the protection of those in power. The leaders of the time convinced themselves that ordinary prisons were not enough. Traditional jails, small, often attached to local courts, were too porous, too lenient, too easily influenced by bribes or sympathy. What was needed was something greater. A fortress of law. A place so dreadful in reputation, so inescapable in design, that the mere mention of its name would quell unrest before it could take root. And so the idea of this prison was born. At its heart lay a simple philosophy: fear is the best deterrent. Rather than reform or rehabilitation, the builders sought total domination. They wanted an institution that would stand not only as a tool of punishment, but as a monument to the strength of the regime. Stone by stone, the prison was envisioned as a weapon in the hands of authority, striking down those who dared to defy. The design was debated in halls of power with chilling precision. Architects, soldiers, and lawmakers gathered to discuss how best to strip men and women of dignity, how to enforce obedience not just through chains but through despair itself. One advisor reportedly declared, "Let them walk into the darkness, and let them forget the taste of freedom." The plans reflected this philosophy. Windows would be few, light scarce, corridors intentionally winding to create disorientation. Cells would be cramped, air limited, silence enforced. No comfort was permitted, for comfort, they believed, bred hope, and hope was dangerous. Funding such a project required enormous wealth, and so it was justified to the public as a necessary safeguard against criminals. Pamphlets and proclamations spread the message that the prison would protect decent citizens from thieves, rebels, and murderers. The people were told that their safety depended on walls so thick that no cry could ever escape. But beneath the rhetoric of safety lay a harsher truth. The prison was meant not only for criminals, but for anyone who might threaten the fragile order of power. As construction began, the labor force that built the walls was composed not of proud craftsmen but of chained men and women, prisoners themselves, forced to dig foundations, haul stones, and shape iron bars. It was a cruel irony. Those destined to inhabit the dungeon were the very ones who laid its bones into the earth. Their sweat and blood sank into the mortar. The clang of their hammers echoed long before the cries of future captives. In this way, the prison was not merely built, it was born out of suffering. Years passed as towers rose and walls stretched skyward. The site chosen for the prison was deliberately isolated, perched on rocky ground where wind whistled through narrow valleys. The remoteness ensured that no family member could easily visit, no message could escape unnoticed, no sympathy could weaken the fortress. To approach the gates was to approach exile itself, for once inside, the world outside grew distant, unreachable. When the final stones were laid, the prison stood like a scar against the horizon. To those who designed it, it was a triumph, a physical embodiment of control. To those who lived nearby, it was a shadow cast over their lives. Farmers working in surrounding fields would glance nervously at its towers. Children dared one another to walk closer, but none lingered long. Even before its doors opened, the place radiated dread. The day of inauguration was marked with grim ceremony. Officials praised the achievement, declaring that justice had been fortified. The people were told that lawbreakers would now know the true meaning of consequence. Yet among the crowd, whispers persisted. Some saw the project for what it was, not a temple of justice, but a monument of fear. A handful of skeptics murmured that no good could come from walls built to crush the human spirit. But their voices were drowned in the cheers of those eager to believe in safety, in order, in the illusion of control. Soon, the first prisoners arrived. Shackled in chains, they were paraded through the gates before onlookers, a spectacle of authority. These early captives were not hardened criminals alone. They included debtors, dissenters, and men whose only crime was speaking too boldly in taverns. Already, the line between guilt and innocence blurred. The prison's appetite was wide, and its hunger unrelenting. From the very beginning, reports leaked of conditions inside. Prisoners were thrown into cells with little regard for health or humanity. Guards were instructed to maintain strict silence, discouraging conversation and companionship. The intention was clear: to break connections, to dissolve solidarity, to turn each inmate into an island of despair. Those who survived spoke of a darkness so complete it felt alive, pressing against their eyes until they could no longer recall the warmth of the sun. But the prison's reputation was not built on prisoner suffering alone. What made it infamous, what gave birth to the legends that endure even now, was that it consumed its keepers as well. From the earliest months, guards began to change. Men who once laughed freely found themselves haunted by silence. Some refused to enter certain corridors, claiming the air itself was too heavy, too full of unseen presence. Whispers spread among the staff that the place was cursed, that the spirits of those forced to build it lingered in the walls. Though officials dismissed such stories, the effect was undeniable. The prison broke down not only its captives but its enforcers. Thus, the monster was born. Conceived in fear, constructed with cruelty, and sustained by silence, it grew into something larger than its builders ever intended. What was meant to be a tool of order became an entity unto itself, a labyrinth of despair that defied reason. It was no longer just a building. It was a machine that devoured human lives, prisoners, guards, and even those who merely brushed against its shadow. And so, the prison entered history not as a proud monument to justice, but as a wound inflicted upon humanity. Each stone carried a story, each barred window a silent scream. The rulers who dreamed of safety had instead created a legacy of fear, one that would echo for centuries. And as the first chapter of its existence closed, the world began to learn a truth it could never quite forget. When men build prisons to control others, they often create cages for themselves as well. The first thing a visitor noticed upon entering the prison was not the sound of chains, nor the cries of captives, but the suffocating presence of its architecture. It was as if the very stones had been arranged to unsettle the human soul. This prison was not designed as a place of shelter or containment. It was crafted as a weapon, a labyrinth of despair where walls seemed to close in on you, where space itself was turned against those who dwelled within. Imagine stepping through its gates. The transition from the outside world to the inside was immediate and brutal. Beyond the iron doors, light dwindled. Torches sputtered along damp corridors, their flames swallowed by the thickness of the air. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, elongating with every flicker, making it impossible to tell where stone ended and darkness began. The ceilings, though high in some chambers, seemed to press downward in others, creating a feeling of compression, as though the building itself were breathing, inhaling slowly, waiting for the moment to crush you. The walls were deliberately thick, so thick that no sound could pass through them. Prisoners could scream until their throats bled, and those in neighboring cells would hear nothing. This silence was not accidental. It was engineered, a cruel form of isolation that denied men and women even the faint comfort of knowing others shared their suffering. In most prisons, the noise of voices, footsteps, or distant cries filled the air. Here, silence ruled. The absence of sound became its own torment, gnawing at the mind, leaving inmates unsure whether they were still part of the living world. The corridors were intentionally confusing. They twisted and turned without logic, creating a disorienting maze. Guards knew the paths, but for prisoners, movement within the prison was designed to blur direction and memory. A man could be dragged through a series of corridors and never again retrace his steps. Even if a door were left unlocked, escape would be nearly impossible. The building itself disoriented its inhabitants, stripping them of any sense of control. The cells, small and unyielding, were crafted not merely to hold but to humiliate. Many were so narrow that men could not fully stretch their arms. The stone floors were damp and cold, with water seeping through cracks, ensuring that the air always smelled faintly of rot and mildew. In some sections, there were no beds, only bare stone, where prisoners were expected to curl upon themselves for rest. In others, iron rings protruded from the walls, used to shackle inmates so that they remained upright for days on end, unable to lie down, unable to find comfort in even the smallest gesture of rest. Light was another weapon. Some cells were left in complete darkness, denying prisoners any sense of day or night. In such places, the body's rhythm faltered. Men forgot how long they had been imprisoned. Days felt like weeks, weeks like months. Others were placed in cells where a single shaft of light fell through a narrow slit, a reminder of the outside world they could no longer touch. That glimpse of sky or moon became both torment and temptation, an unreachable promise beyond iron and stone. Air, too, was rationed by design. Ventilation shafts were scarce, leaving many chambers stifling. The air grew heavy with the stench of sweat, sickness, and unwashed bodies. Breathing became labor, and with it came the constant reminder that freedom, the simple act of taking in fresh air, was denied. Guards reported that some prisoners pressed their faces to cracks in the walls, straining to catch the faintest whiff of wind, as though that breath were worth more than gold. Beyond physical discomfort, the architecture played tricks on the mind. Echoes carried strangely through the prison. A single step could resound as if it came from every direction. Whispers seemed to linger long after the speaker had fallen silent. In the dead of night, prisoners reported hearing voices they could not place, sometimes words, sometimes sobs, sometimes only the faint laughter of something unseen. Whether these were the product of acoustics or imagination, no one could be certain. But the effect was undeniable. The walls themselves seemed alive, murmuring secrets in the darkness. For the guards, the building was both fortress and trap. They walked its corridors with keys clinking at their belts, but even they admitted that the design wore on their minds. Long shifts spent in the same dim hallways led to strange sensations, the feeling of being followed, the impression of figures moving in the corners of vision. Some claimed that the narrow staircases seemed to shift in height, that doors appeared where none had been before, that the building itself rearranged to confuse them. Such stories, while dismissed as superstition, fed the growing reputation that this prison was not merely a structure but a living entity. The outer walls were perhaps the most imposing feature. Rising like cliffs, they seemed to cut the prison off from the world entirely. From outside, their sheer size discouraged any thought of approach. From inside, they symbolized hopelessness. Prisoners who glimpsed them through barred windows or during brief marches in courtyards realized the truth. Escape was not just improbable, it was impossible. The walls were higher than ladders could reach, stronger than tools could break, wider than time itself could wear down. Inmates described them not as walls, but as mountains. Mountains of stone that surrounded their lives, trapping them in a valley of despair. And yet, the cruelty of the architecture lay not only in its harshness but in its subtlety. The building was constructed not with chaos, but with intent. Every element, silence, darkness, narrowness, isolation, was carefully chosen to erode the prisoner's sense of self. Over time, inmates stopped fighting. They ceased to dream of freedom. They became part of the stone, as motionless and mute as the walls themselves. Historians who later studied the prison argued that it represented the pinnacle of punitive design, where architecture transcended mere function and became psychological warfare. It was a place where the environment itself became the jailer, where despair was built into the foundations, where madness seeped from brick to bone. Even now, long after the gates have closed, those who enter its ruins describe an atmosphere unlike any other. The air feels heavier, the silence deeper, the shadows longer. Some claim that the walls still breathe, that if you press your ear to the stone, you can hear faint murmurs, remnants of those who once lived and died within. Whether truth or imagination, such impressions remind us of what this place was meant to be, a structure that did not simply contain despair but embodied it. The prison's architecture was its cruelest guard. No man could escape its reach. No woman could resist its weight. And in time, the very design meant to maintain control succeeded not only in trapping bodies but in breaking spirits, until even the strongest admitted defeat. The building itself was the punishment, and it remains, in memory, one of the most chilling examples of how stone and silence can be turned into instruments of madness. The journey begins not with silence, but with the clatter of chains. Imagine yourself bound in iron, wrists rubbed raw by the cold bite of shackles, ankles chafed with every step. You have been marched through streets not as a person but as a warning, paraded before the eyes of neighbors and strangers alike. Now, at last, the procession has ended. Before you looms the gate of the prison, vast and unyielding, its iron teeth glinting faintly in the pale light. You are about to enter a world from which few return unchanged. The guards at your side do not speak. Their hands are firm, their faces blank. They do not need to tell you what you already know, that you are leaving the world behind. The moment you step through that gate, you will no longer be husband, daughter, brother, or friend. You will be something else, a number, a body, a shadow swallowed by stone. The creak of the gate echoes as it opens, and with each step forward, the sound of the outside world fades until it is gone completely. Inside, the air changes. It is colder here, heavy with dampness, tinged with the faint stench of rot and rust. Torches flicker along the walls, their flames struggling to pierce the thick darkness. Shadows gather in corners, stretching across the damp floor like reaching fingers. The silence is punctuated only by the echo of boots and the metallic rattle of chains. Already, you feel the weight of the place pressing down upon you, as though the very stones resent your presence. The guards lead you down a corridor. The walls are close, the ceilings low, and the passage twists in ways that leave you disoriented. Your eyes strain to adjust, but the light never seems enough. Somewhere in the distance, a door slams. Somewhere else, faintly, a voice cries out, cut short by silence. You cannot tell how far away it is. You cannot tell if it came from above, below, or beside you. The building bends sound until you feel surrounded, watched, pursued by things unseen. At last, you are brought into a chamber where your identity is to be stripped away. The guards take your name, though it hardly matters. From this moment forward, you are not who you were. The clothes you wore, the last pieces of your old life, are pulled from you. In their place, you are given rags, coarse fabric that offers no warmth, no comfort, no dignity. The iron remains on your wrists and ankles. Even your hair may be cut, a final insult, as if to erase any remnant of self. You are no longer an individual, but one more shadow among many. The keeper of records watches you with indifferent eyes. To him, you are not a story, not a person with memories, family, or dreams. You are an entry in a book, a mark on a page. Numbers replace names, and with them, humanity fades. Your fate is sealed not only by the chains on your body but by the ink that binds you in their ledger. The act is swift, efficient, practiced, a ritual of erasure carried out countless times before you. From there, you are led deeper. Each corridor seems colder, narrower, more suffocating. The air grows heavy. You begin to notice details, the faint scratches along the stone where others clawed in desperation, the burn marks where torches scorched walls, the grooves in the floor where chains have dragged for years. Each mark is a story, each scar a whisper of those who came before. The building itself is a witness, and it does not forget. You pass doors that hide unseen lives. Through a small slit, you glimpse a pair of eyes staring out, hollow and sunken, filled with an emptiness that chills you more than anger ever could. Another door rattles as fists pound from the inside. A hoarse voice begs, pleads, curses, then falls silent. The guards do not pause. They do not acknowledge the sounds. To them, it is ordinary, no more unusual than the sound of wind. Finally, you reach your cell. The door creaks open, and you are thrust inside. The clang of iron bars slamming shut behind you reverberates like a final judgment. This is your world now, four walls of rough stone, damp to the touch. The ceiling is low, the floor uneven. In one corner lies a bucket for your needs. In another, a patch of straw thin enough to do little more than soften the stone beneath. There is no window, only a narrow slit high above, too small to see through, too high to reach. The air is stagnant. You breathe shallowly, your lungs resisting the heaviness. The silence is broken only by your own breathing, but as the minutes stretch into hours, you begin to hear more. A drip of water somewhere in the dark. The shuffle of rats across the floor. And beneath it all, faintly, the heartbeat of the prison itself, the shifting of stone, the whisper of echoes, the groan of wood and iron. It feels alive, as though it knows you are here, as though it waits to see how long you will last. Night falls, though you would not know it save for the sudden absence of footsteps in the hall. The guards retreat to their stations, and the prison settles into its strange nocturnal rhythm. Some prisoners cry softly in the dark, their voices carrying faintly through cracks and slits. Others sing, low and broken, clinging to melodies that remind them of lives long past. Still others whisper prayers, though whether to gods or to themselves, none can say. You lie on the straw, the iron pressing into your skin, and listen. Time drips by, indistinguishable, endless. It is in this first night that the prison truly begins its work. The loss of identity, the silence, the darkness, the weight of stone, each presses upon you, reshaping the contours of your mind. You begin to wonder, will I remember who I was? Will I forget the faces of those I love? Already, their features blur as fear sharpens. The walls are closing in. The air is too thin. And the thought creeps into your mind, unwelcome but unshakable, perhaps I will never leave this place alive. The guards know this transformation well. They have seen it in countless faces before you. On the first day, prisoners arrive defiant, trembling with fear but still clinging to fragments of self. By the second day, the silence begins to eat away at them. By the third, they are quieter, less certain, their eyes wandering, searching for something they cannot name. By the first week, most have begun to crumble. Some break in weeping. Others fall into silence so complete it is as if they have ceased to exist. The prison does not rush. It takes its time, grinding the spirit down grain by grain. As you lie there, the darkness surrounding you, you understand what so many before have felt. This place is not simply a prison. It is an ending. The life you once knew is behind you, fading into memory. The world outside grows distant, unreachable. Here, in these walls, you are no longer yourself. You are simply another echo, another shadow, another captive claimed by stone and iron. And yet, deep within, a spark lingers. For now, you still remember your name. You still recall the sound of laughter, the warmth of the sun, the touch of freedom. But with each passing hour, you feel those memories slipping. The prison waits patiently, knowing that sooner or later, it will have them all. The prison is not built of stone alone. Its walls are made equally of the lives it holds within them, lives fractured and bent beneath the weight of captivity. Step closer, and you begin to sense the multitude of stories breathing in the dark. Some cells hold silence, others whispers, and a few erupt into sudden cries of madness. Together, they form a chorus of broken souls, a reminder that the prison's truest chains are not the ones locked around wrists, but the ones forged within the mind. The first faces you meet are hollow. Eyes stare back at you through the gloom, eyes stripped of hope, sunken into pale faces. These are men and women who no longer expect rescue. Their bodies remain, but something deeper has faded, something that once made them whole. Their movements are mechanical, their words few, their thoughts drowned in years of endless waiting. It is here that you learn the first cruel truth of the prison: not all sentences are written in years. Some are carved into the soul until freedom itself loses meaning. Every prisoner carries a story, though most are buried under layers of silence. There is the thief who once walked proudly through markets, pockets swift as shadows. In his first days, he boasted of escape, swore no wall could hold him. Now, he sits against the stone, fingernails chipped from clawing at mortar, his spirit dulled into resignation. When he speaks, it is only to mutter the names of streets he once knew, as if repeating them might keep the memory alive. Beside him, in another cell, is a woman accused of witchcraft. Her hair is matted, her skin bruised from interrogations she refuses to speak of. The fire that once burned in her eyes now flickers only faintly, like the last embers of a dying flame. Yet, at night, when the prison falls quiet, she hums a melody. It drifts faintly through the corridors, haunting in its fragility. Those who hear it sometimes weep, for the song carries both sorrow and strength, a reminder that even in darkness, the voice of defiance endures. Further down, a different soul awaits. A man who once wore the robes of a scholar sits in chains heavier than most. His crime was not theft, nor violence, but words spoken against those who wielded power. His books were burned, his followers scattered. Now he scratches verses into the stone with his nails, letters rough and jagged, destined to fade with time. Yet he writes all the same, leaving behind fragments of thoughts in a place meant to erase them. Some prisoners whisper that his writings are sacred, a hidden scripture etched into the bones of the prison itself. But not all are silent philosophers or mournful singers. Madness lives here too, wandering in broken laughter. One man shouts at shadows, carrying conversations with figures only he can see. Another tears at his hair, convinced insects crawl beneath his skin. Their cries echo through the night, shaking the already frayed nerves of those nearby. Yet even in their madness, there lies a cruel truth. This is what the prison does to those who cannot bend. When the mind resists too fiercely, it fractures. Madness becomes its own kind of escape, a door swinging inward when all others remain locked. The youngest prisoners are perhaps the hardest to behold. Children, barely more than 12 or 13, accused of theft, rebellion, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They huddle in corners, eyes wide with a fear too great for their years. Their voices are soft, whispering prayers for mothers they may never see again. Some are adopted by older inmates, treated like fragile siblings, guarded as best as circumstances allow. But even here, the weight of captivity crushes quickly. Childhood is a luxury stripped away, leaving only hollow gazes where innocence once lived. Despite the despair, strange bonds form in the darkness. Prisoners who were enemies outside these walls sometimes share food, warmth, or whispered comfort. In the absence of freedom, they create fragments of family, fragile and fleeting. A piece of bread passed through the bars. A whispered story of the world beyond, told to remind others that life still exists outside. Even a simple touch, a hand brushing against another, becomes an act of rebellion against the crushing isolation. But trust is a dangerous currency. Betrayal is common, for the guards often dangle promises of leniency to those willing to inform. A careless word can lead to torture, or worse, to execution. Thus, every bond is shadowed by suspicion. Prisoners learn to speak in half-truths, to guard their thoughts, to wear masks even in their most vulnerable moments. The prison thrives on this tension, feeding off the paranoia that keeps its captives divided. Still, hope lingers, fragile though it is. In hushed tones, some whisper of escape tunnels long buried, of guards willing to turn a blind eye for gold, of storms that weaken the walls. These whispers travel through the prison like sparks, igniting small fires in the hearts of those listening. Most of the tales are false, yet the hope they bring is real. Hope, even when built on lies, is sometimes the only thing that keeps a prisoner alive. Night reveals the prison's truest symphony. As darkness deepens, voices rise. Some weep into the straw. Some pray to gods who seem deaf to their pleas. Others curse the walls, the guards, the world itself. And then, woven among these sounds, are stories whispered from one cell to the next. A tale of a family waiting at home. A memory of love. A description of a sunrise long unseen. These fragments of humanity cling to the air, refusing to be silenced. In the blackness, prisoners remind one another, "We are still alive, we still remember, we still exist." The guards patrol, indifferent to the chorus around them. To them, the prisoners are nothing more than tasks to be managed, bodies to be fed or beaten as ordered. Yet even they cannot entirely ignore the weight of the souls they contain. Some guards laugh, mocking the suffering. Others grow quiet, avoiding the eyes that follow them in silence. A few, perhaps, feel guilt, though they hide it well. For to feel too deeply here is to risk being swallowed by the same despair as those behind the bars. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. The prison does not mark time kindly. Calendars are forbidden, clocks absent. Time blurs, erasing the boundaries between yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Inmates measure their existence not by days but by small events: the changing of guards, the arrival of a meager meal, the echo of a new voice in the corridor. Life becomes a cycle of waiting, a slow erosion of self. Yet through it all, the broken souls endure. Some bend, some fracture, some cling desperately to the last sparks of their humanity. Each cell tells a story, though most will never be written. Each prisoner carries within them a truth about suffering, resilience, and the fragile line between survival and surrender. And in the end, it is these souls, their silence, their songs, their madness, that give the prison its heartbeat. For while the walls are built of stone, it is the people within them who make the place alive. Without them, it would be nothing but an empty shell. With them, it becomes something far more haunting, a graveyard for the living, where the echoes of broken souls linger long after their bodies are gone. Behind every prison of legend stands the presence of those charged with maintaining order, yet in this place, even the keepers were not immune to the horrors within. These were men trained to wield authority, to enforce discipline, to suppress dissent, and yet the prison slowly consumed them in ways no brute force could anticipate. The very walls that trapped the inmates also trapped the guards' minds, twisting reality, bending reason, and transforming the watchers into shadows of the very prisoners they oversaw. At first, the guards arrived full of confidence. Young men with steady hands and unwavering loyalty were assigned to patrol the labyrinthine corridors. They carried the keys to every cell, the authority to command obedience, and the belief that their presence ensured the smooth functioning of a grand institution of justice. Their uniforms were sharp, their boots polished, their eyes alert. They believed they were in control. Control, however, is a fragile illusion. Within days, the first cracks appeared. The corridors stretched endlessly, the darkness pressing at the edges of perception. Footsteps echoed, multiplied, and warped through stone halls, producing sounds that could not exist. A faint whisper behind a door, a shadow flickering at the corner of vision, a floorboard creaking when no one walked upon it, all of these phenomena began to chip away at their certainty. The prison was alive, or at least it seemed to be, and its heartbeat was steady and unyielding. Some guards were first affected by fatigue. The shifts were long and relentless. Days melted into nights, nights into days, and the monotony became suffocating. The dim light of torches and the constant chill of the stone air wore down even the most resilient. Those who slept found themselves haunted by the echoes of screams they could not place, by visions of prisoners' faces contorted in fear, by the low, insistent hum of despair that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The mind, unprepared for such sustained exposure to darkness and suffering, began to fray. Isolation played its part. Many guards were stationed alone for hours at a time, wandering hallways that seemed to shift, descending staircases that appeared longer than before. Conversations with fellow men were rare, often limited to brief exchanges in the courtyard or the distant shout of commands. In the absence of social grounding, hallucinations took hold. A flicker in the corner of vision became a figure. A shadow cast by a torch became a person moving silently toward them. Footsteps echoed behind them even when the corridor was empty. The line between reality and imagination blurred, and some guards could no longer trust their own senses. With the erosion of perception came subtle but significant changes in behavior. A man who had been patient now barked orders at prisoners unnecessarily, punishing them for imagined offenses. Another began muttering to himself, recounting conversations that never occurred. Laughter disappeared, replaced by grim silence. Sleep, when it came, was troubled by dreams that felt as real as waking hours, dreams in which the prison expanded infinitely, doors led nowhere, and the screams of the captive reached intolerable heights. Over months and years, the effects compounded. Some guards began to show signs of complete mental collapse. One was found wandering corridors at night, murmuring names of prisoners long gone. Another refused to enter the West Wing, claiming it was alive and hungry for souls. Superstitions flourished, whispered from one trembling watchman to another. Certain cells were avoided entirely, doors left unopened, floors unrevealed, not out of defiance, but out of terror. The prison had become a predator, and its keepers had learned that defiance might lead to nothing but madness. Yet the descent was not uniform. Some guards embraced cruelty as a defense mechanism. By punishing others more severely, they attempted to convince themselves that they were still in control, that the terror they inflicted was theirs to command. This, however, was a dangerous illusion. For every act of cruelty committed with confidence, another insidious effect emerged: guilt, paranoia, and fear. Men began to suspect one another of hidden motives. Whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire: who would inform the warden, who would overstep the bounds of loyalty, who might secretly aid a prisoner. The atmosphere became charged with suspicion, a pressure cooker of anxiety. The prison rewarded neither strength nor cruelty. Even those who excelled at enforcement found themselves slipping. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, and exposure to continuous despair left their mark. Some guards, once strong and commanding, developed tics, uncontrollable movements of the hands, repeated muttering, tremors in the voice. Others would laugh suddenly, unnaturally, in the middle of the night, as if compelled by some invisible presence. Over time, it became clear that survival required more than obedience or physical strength. It required a kind of psychological immunity that few could sustain. Some men attempted to escape the madness by finding small comforts, passing a whispered joke to a fellow guard, sharing a meal quietly, or pretending to ignore the oddities around them. But these moments were fleeting. The prison tolerated nothing extraneous to its design. Even a hint of normalcy, a smile, a song, a touch of humor, was crushed by the relentless rhythm of its corridors, the echoing cries, the chilling damp, and the omnipresent weight of stone. There were stories of guards who sought to resist the creeping despair through outward displays of ritual. One carried a talisman, another marked days on the wall with chalk, a third muttered prayers under his breath. Such efforts provided temporary relief, a sense of agency in a world designed to strip it away. But the prison was patient. Its strategy was slow, deliberate, and unyielding. It did not require immediate destruction. It could wait, and in waiting, it broke even the strongest. Some guards fell completely. They would wander the halls at night, talking to figures unseen, tracing the paths of ghosts with trembling hands, their sanity unmoored. Others grew violent, striking prisoners or fellow guards without cause, driven by hallucinations or paranoia. The prison became a mirror. Those who entered full of confidence and authority often left hollowed and haunted, their humanity corroded by the same despair that claimed their charges. Yet, paradoxically, the prison depended on its keepers' presence. The men were both victims and enforcers, participants in a system that devoured them as surely as it did the inmates. Without them, the institution could not function. And so the cycle continued, guards arriving with courage, leaving in pieces, replaced by others unprepared for what lay ahead. Over decades, the story repeated itself, leaving a legacy of fear not only in the cells but in the minds of those entrusted to hold the keys. By the end, the keepers themselves were as much a part of the prison as its walls, its corridors, its cells. They spoke in hushed tones about the feeling in the West Wing, about doors that shifted overnight, about cries heard when no one was near. New recruits were warned, subtly or not, about the madness that awaited. Older guards, scarred in body and mind, would nod knowingly, having walked the slow descent firsthand. And the first rule became clear: to survive here was to adapt, or to be consumed, just as those within the walls were consumed daily. The prison did not merely confine. It punished, and its methods were crafted with careful cruelty. These were not haphazard acts of violence, but deliberate strategies designed to erode body and mind. Every punishment was part of a larger system, a psychological architecture of suffering that extended far beyond the lash or the iron chain. It was a symphony of torment, where each note was calculated to instill fear, obedience, and despair. Physical punishment was immediate, precise, and unrelenting. Beatings with rods, straps, and wooden boards were standard. Guards were trained not to strike blindly, but to deliver pain in a way that would linger, slow, and haunt. A blow to the shoulder might seem minor at first, but days later, movement would be stiff, limbs weak, and every step a reminder of the previous cruelty. The fear of the next strike became as oppressive as the blows themselves. Prisoners began to anticipate pain, and in doing so, it became constant in their thoughts, never allowing relief. Chains and shackles were another instrument of suffering. Some prisoners were confined in iron cuffs that restricted not only movement but blood flow, leaving fingers and toes numb, tinged blue, sometimes permanently damaged. Others were bound in positions that prevented rest, forced to remain upright, kneeling, or suspended from hooks. Sleep, the natural balm of the body, was denied. And yet, the worst aspect was not just the physical discomfort, but the mental torment, a realization that the body itself could be controlled, bent, and broken, leaving the mind to wrestle endlessly with helplessness. Darkness was perhaps the cruelest tool of all. Some cells were stripped of light entirely. Prisoners could feel the walls, but could not see them. Hours passed with no knowledge of time. The human mind, designed to rely on cycles of day and night, began to falter. In that darkness, imagination took over. Shapes appeared in the corners of vision. Shadows lengthened, flickered, and moved without cause. Footsteps seemed to echo endlessly, whispers arose from nowhere, and the silence pressed so heavily that it became tactile. In these cells, the mind itself became a battlefield, often lost before the body could even be touched. Hunger and deprivation were subtle, persistent punishments. Meals, when delivered, were meager and sporadic. The food was often cold, stale, or barely edible. Prisoners learned to measure time not by sunrise or sunset, but by the arrival of scraps of bread or water. When denied nourishment, even briefly, the body's weakness amplified every other form of torment. Fatigue, thirst, and hunger combined with isolation and fear to strip the spirit almost completely. The prison understood that suffering multiplied when layered, and deprivation ensured that the mind and body remained in constant tension. Psychological torture was equally sophisticated. Prisoners were sometimes subjected to sensory confusion, forced to remain in one area while guards manipulated light and sound to disorient them. In other cases, they were made to witness the punishment of others, friends, neighbors, or strangers, without being able to intervene. The screams carried long after the lash had fallen. Such exposure created an emotional landscape of fear, guilt, and helplessness, ensuring that every prisoner internalized the cruelty, anticipating it in their own cells, long before it arrived. Isolation, while silent, was devastating. Solitary confinement was not simply separation, it was designed to erase identity. Prisoners in these cells were denied contact with others, denied sensory stimulation, sometimes even denied the use of language. Days and nights blended. Thoughts circled endlessly. Without human interaction, the mind struggles to maintain coherence. Some inmates whispered to themselves to preserve sanity, others lost their grip entirely. This form of punishment left scars deeper than any wound inflicted by iron or rod, for it attacked the core of human experience, the need for connection. Forced labor served as another form of control and punishment. Prisoners were made to haul stones, dig ditches, or construct fortifications, often under extreme conditions. Work was not intended to benefit the inmates, it was a demonstration of authority and a method to exhaust both body and mind. Sun, wind, and rain became additional tools in this design, each element leveraged to ensure compliance and break resistance. The exhaustion, combined with fear, deprivation, and threat of violence, produced a state of near-permanent submission. The guards, too, were instruments of punishment. They were trained to observe, manipulate, and exploit vulnerabilities. They would prod prisoners psychologically, delivering taunts, threats, or false hope. A word whispered incorrectly, a glance misinterpreted, could result in sudden and extreme punishment. The uncertainty itself was a form of cruelty, a constant, invisible whip. Inmates were never certain of safety, of justice, or of mercy. This perpetual tension prevented adaptation, ensuring that the psychological grip of the prison remained tight. Some punishments were uniquely tailored to break the strongest spirits. Prisoners accused of defiance were sometimes confined in spaces so small that movement was impossible. Others were forced to endure extreme cold or heat. Water was used sparingly, sometimes withheld entirely, sometimes poured over bodies in methods designed to shock and disorient. Sleep deprivation was combined with other forms of torture to multiply their effects. Pain was never arbitrary. It was planned, administered with precision, measured to exact limits, and repeated until the body and mind surrendered simultaneously. The threat of execution lingered like a shadow over every punishment. While death was rare, the fear of it was constant. Some prisoners were paraded as examples, shown the instruments of execution, forced to stand in cells where previous captives had met their end. The awareness that one's life could be ended at any moment amplified every other form of torment. Fear became a constant companion, seeping into every corner of the mind, ensuring that prisoners' energy was consumed in worry as much as in survival. Despite the relentlessness of the methods, some prisoners discovered small ways to resist, to preserve fragments of self. A whispered prayer, a song hummed softly, a memory recalled in silence, these acts were small rebellions. Even in the harshest cells, some would hide scraps of writing, inscribe names on walls, or memorize the cracks and patterns of stone. Such acts carried immense risk, yet they preserved identity in a place intent on erasing it. It is here that the genius and horror of the prison becomes apparent. Its architecture, its guards, and its punishments were part of a single, unified strategy, to break the body, disorient the mind, and dissolve the soul. Every element worked in concert, reinforcing every other. Pain was magnified by isolation, despair compounded by fatigue, madness incubated by darkness. By the time a prisoner had endured weeks or months, survival itself became a testament to human resilience rather than a triumph over the prison. Stories of punishment became legends, whispered among cells. The cries of one inmate warned another. Accounts of brutality, once passed orally, shaped behavior and expectation. Fear became anticipatory. Even those not yet subjected to torture felt its presence, and in that preemptive dread, the prison extended its reach beyond the physical. Knowledge of the methods ensured compliance, making the threat as potent as the act itself. Yet the prison system of torment had a perverse elegance. Its effectiveness lay in its ability to break those who entered while leaving the structure intact, undamaged. The institution did not rely solely on cruelty, nor on fear alone. It combined both with time, patience, and meticulous design. Its success was not measured in immediate screams or resistance crushed, but in the slow erosion of hope, identity, and resistance. By the end, the prisoner was a shadow of their former self. The body was weakened, the mind anxious, the spirit uncertain. Some retained fragments of hope, others descended into madness, and a few found ways to endure with small acts of defiance. But all bore the mark of the prison, a lasting impression of the methods that ensured it held dominion over every aspect of life inside its walls. And so, these shadows of torture tell us not only what the prison did, but how it accomplished it. Through design, discipline, deprivation, and psychological mastery, the prison became more than a building. It became an ecosystem of suffering, a meticulously engineered machine capable of breaking even the strongest minds. Its horror is timeless, a testament to the extremes of control and the fragility of human endurance. Even in a place designed to crush hope, the human spirit finds ways to flicker. The prison, for all its darkness and cruelty, could not entirely extinguish whispers of resistance. Rumors spread like sparks in dry grass, small, fragile, but capable of igniting daring thoughts in the hearts of those who had almost forgotten what it meant to hope. In the shadows, prisoners began to share stories, not only of despair, but of courage, ingenuity, and fleeting opportunities to defy the system that sought to consume them. At first, these whispers were cautious. A prisoner might hint to another about a loose stone in a corridor, a faint crack in the wall, or a weak lock in a distant cell. The information was shared in hushed tones, behind closed doors, or during brief, unsupervised moments in the yard. Guards could not be trusted, and betrayal could be lethal. Yet the desire to resist persisted, a quiet but insistent pulse beneath the weight of oppression. Even the most broken souls longed for a glimpse of agency, a chance to reclaim a fragment of their lives. Small acts of rebellion began to appear. Prisoners refused to respond immediately to harsh commands, delaying as long as possible without attracting notice. Some altered the arrangement of straw in their cells to communicate silently with neighbors. Others whispered prayers or chants at unusual times, leaving traces of their existence and unity. These acts were minor, almost imperceptible, yet their effect was profound. Each act of subtle defiance reminded the prisoners that they were still alive, that the prison had not entirely claimed them. Rumors were the most powerful tool of resistance. One tale might describe a tunnel supposedly hidden beneath the eastern wing. Another might claim that a guard could be persuaded with bribes or kindness. Some stories were exaggerated or false, yet even falsehoods carried hope. Imagination became a form of freedom. The mind, though confined, could wander beyond the walls. These rumors, exchanged in secrecy, created bonds between prisoners, weaving a web of silent solidarity that the guards could not fully unravel. The psychology of rebellion was as crucial as its physical expression. The mere thought of escape or defiance sparked adrenaline, rekindled memory, and reinforced identity. Prisoners who engaged in these tiny acts of rebellion often felt renewed, if only momentarily. A shared glance across a corridor could communicate understanding, defiance, or solidarity. A whispered message passed from one cell to another became a lifeline. In a place designed to erase individuality, these acts preserved it, like fragile petals growing in cracks of stone. Yet rebellion carried immense risk. Guards punished any perceived insubordination swiftly and brutally, ensuring that defiance was never without consequence. Some prisoners were executed for attempting to communicate beyond their cells. Others were tortured publicly as warnings. This combination of fear and punishment created a delicate balance. Resistance was both necessary and deadly. Every act required courage, ingenuity, and trust that others would not betray the secret. Despite the danger, plots formed. Groups of prisoners communicated through subtle signals, marks on walls, the arrangement of stones, or patterns of knocking that mimicked speech. Some attempted to fashion tools from scraps of metal or wood. Others collected fragments of rope or cloth to aid in climbing or escaping. Every detail mattered. Even a single misstep could lead to discovery and instant reprisal. The tension in these secretive preparations was palpable, a quiet undercurrent of excitement and fear that pulsed beneath the usual atmosphere of despair. The prison also became a school of strategy. Those who survived long enough to engage in these secret networks learned patience, observation, and cunning. Guards' routines were mapped meticulously. Shifts and patrol patterns memorized. The weaknesses of the building were catalogued in memory, every crack and corner analyzed. It was a battle of intellect as much as courage. Every whispered plan was a test of mental fortitude, a subtle war waged entirely within the mind before any action could take place in the physical world. Rumors sometimes grew into acts of organized resistance, though these were rare and often short-lived. A group might attempt to overpower a guard during a shift change, only to be swiftly subdued. Another might coordinate hunger strikes to protest treatment, forcing the guards to respond, however minimally. These incidents, while small in scope, reverberated through the prison. They reminded everyone that the walls could be challenged, even if momentarily, and that the human will could still find ways to assert itself. The consequences of discovery were severe, ensuring that rebellion remained a delicate, hidden art. Betrayal was always a danger. Some prisoners, seeking favor or leniency, revealed plans to the guards, extinguishing sparks of hope in the process. Others were coerced into informing under threat or torture. Such betrayals reinforced the atmosphere of fear, making trust both precious and perilous. And yet, even in the face of these dangers, some continued to resist, proving that defiance, however small, was an innate part of survival. Even stories of failed attempts contributed to the collective resilience. When a plan was uncovered or a prisoner punished, the narrative did not vanish entirely. Lessons were learned, methods refined, and resolve strengthened. The prison, in its oppressive efficiency, could not entirely suppress the instinct to resist. And in these small, flickering acts of rebellion, whispers, secret signals, and fleeting defiance, the prisoners preserved their humanity against overwhelming odds. In the quietest moments of the night, these flickers of resistance became almost tangible. A prisoner might see another glance toward the ceiling, read a subtle mark on a wall, or feel a brush of a hand where none should be. These were reminders that, despite the darkness, life continued. Despite the weight of despair, minds remained vigilant, hearts still dared to hope. And though the path to freedom was uncertain, the mere act of planning, of imagining, of whispering secrets, became a form of survival in itself. Ultimately, rebellion in the prison was less about immediate escape and more about the preservation of identity. Every whispered plan, every small act of defiance, every rumor carried forward served to tell the prisoners, and perhaps themselves, that they were still present, still human, and still capable of agency. It was a quiet but powerful assertion that, no matter the cruelty surrounding them, they were not entirely conquered. In a prison designed to break both body and spirit, the mind often became the first battlefield. The relentless weight of confinement, darkness, deprivation, and fear did more than cause suffering, it reshaped perception itself. Days and nights blurred, hallucinations seeped into waking thought, and memory, once a reliable anchor, began to twist and fray. Here, the line between reality and illusion was not just blurred, it was intentionally erased. Some prisoners lost the ability to mark time. Without sunlight, clocks, or even a sense of routine, days and nights merged into one continuous expanse. A single day might feel like a week might feel like a year. This temporal distortion left inmates disoriented and vulnerable, unable to distinguish the present from the past. They would repeat the same movements, mutter the same words, or relive old traumas as though they were happening in the moment. Memory became both a curse and a sanctuary, cherished for preserving identity, yet treacherous in its capacity to confuse and torment. Hallucinations became common companions. Some prisoners reported seeing figures move in the shadows, whispering names that had long been forgotten. Others felt invisible hands brushing their skin, or heard footsteps echoing when no one was present. Sounds were exaggerated, distorted, or imagined entirely. A dripping water leak could become the roar of rushing blood, a gust of wind, the footsteps of approaching doom. The mind, starved of sensory stability and social reinforcement, began to fabricate its own reality, merging fear, memory, and imagination into a tapestry indistinguishable from truth. Sleep, or the lack of it, further accelerated mental deterioration. The prison deliberately manipulated schedules, forced labor, and emotional stress to disrupt natural cycles. When prisoners did manage to rest, dreams were vivid, terrifying, and often indistinguishable from waking life. Some reported reliving past traumas repeatedly, while others were haunted by visions of guards, shadows, or the faces of fellow prisoners distorted beyond recognition. Over time, these nocturnal experiences blended seamlessly into daylight hours, leaving the mind perpetually on edge, unable to distinguish nightmare from reality. Isolation exacerbated the effect. In solitary cells, the absence of human contact made hallucinations and delusions nearly inevitable. Prisoners would talk to themselves for hours, imagining conversations with friends or family, pleading for mercy or reliving events long past. Some became convinced that walls were alive, shifting and closing in, or that the entire prison was a living entity intent on consuming them. Others heard the cries of the dead echoing through the stone, whispers of souls who had vanished years before. These experiences were terrifyingly real, and even those who retained fragments of sanity could not fully dismiss them. Memory itself became unreliable. Events were misremembered, reordered, or merged into grotesque narratives. Prisoners might confuse the present with years-old punishments, recalling pain and terror as though it were occurring again. Faces of friends, family, or fellow captives warped into unfamiliar shapes, replaced by shadows or grotesque caricatures. Some remembered names incorrectly, others forgot them entirely. Time and memory, the twin pillars of human identity, were under constant siege, eroding the sense of self that the prison sought to preserve only to destroy. Madness often followed in predictable patterns. Some prisoners withdrew entirely, ceasing communication, retreating into silent contemplation or dissociation. Others became hyperactive, pacing endlessly, shouting to shadows, or performing repetitive tasks with obsessive precision. Emotional responses were heightened and unstable. Moments of extreme fear, joy, or despair could shift rapidly. Rational thought fractured under the constant pressure of fear, isolation, and sensory deprivation. Even the strongest-willed individuals often succumbed to these slow, insidious changes. Some inmates experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic symptoms: hypervigilance, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts. Every creak of the floor, every murmur in the corridors, every shadow could trigger panic. Their brains, forced into survival mode, interpreted every stimulus as a potential threat. Over time, this constant hyperalertness became exhausting, amplifying paranoia and distrust. Fellow prisoners were sometimes seen as enemies, and guards could appear omnipresent even when absent. The mind itself became a prison within the prison, a maze of fear and confusion from which there was no easy escape. The prison also distorted identity. Some prisoners took on alternate personalities, adopting new names or behaviors to cope with the horror. Others forgot who they were entirely, responding only to immediate threats or tasks. The slow, deliberate erosion of individuality was a calculated effect of the environment. The combination of confinement, punishment, and isolation reshaped human behavior in ways that left lasting scars. By the time inmates left, if they ever did, they were often unrecognizable, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. Madness could manifest socially as well. Groups of prisoners, when brought together, sometimes reinforced delusions and irrational fears. A single whispered rumor could spiral into collective panic. Shadows might be seen moving in unison, cries could echo in ways that seemed coordinated. The interplay between isolation and social interaction created an environment where reality itself became negotiable, a fragile construct constantly under siege. In this way, the prison's architecture of fear extended beyond individual cells, infecting entire corridors with uncertainty, anxiety, and dread. Yet, even amid the insanity, fragments of memory survived. Prisoners clung to familiar rituals, repeated phrases, or small acts of defiance. A whispered prayer, a song hummed quietly, a stone rearranged to mark the passage of time, all served as lifelines to sanity. These acts, however minor, were crucial. They preserved threads of identity and humanity, allowing prisoners to navigate the blurred line between madness and memory, between delusion and reality. Even the faintest recollection of the world outside offered a tether, a reason to endure, a reason to hope. By the end of imprisonment, the mind had been reshaped in ways both subtle and profound. Some survivors carried the scars of hallucinations and delusions for life. Others emerged with fragmented memories, unable to distinguish what truly happened from what was imagined. The prison had accomplished its ultimate goal. It had taken ordinary minds and twisted them, proving that captivity's cruelty was not limited to the body. The intellect, memory, and perception of the self could all be bent and broken by sustained exposure to fear, deprivation, and despair. In the darkest cells, the war between madness and memory became almost sacred in its intensity. Each prisoner fought to hold onto something enduring: the knowledge of their name, the memory of a loved one, the sense of right and wrong. Some succeeded partially, others failed entirely. And yet, the struggle itself was a testament to human resilience, a subtle reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the mind does not surrender easily. It adapts, resists, and sometimes survives in fragments, carrying with it the echoes of both suffering and endurance. The prison's design ensured that madness was not just a byproduct but an inevitable consequence. The combination of darkness, isolation, deprivation, sensory manipulation, and fear created a psychological environment that was as lethal as any physical punishment. The human mind, exposed to these conditions for weeks, months, or years, inevitably transformed. And in these transformations, the prison claimed a kind of victory that was total, intimate, and irreversible. Yet, even as madness consumed many, memory remained the last frontier. Those who could preserve fragments of recollection, names, voices, faces, smells of the world outside, were partially shielded from total collapse. Memory became both weapon and refuge, a way to resist the totalizing despair of the environment. And in the quietest moments, prisoners would whisper to themselves, repeating these memories like mantras, fragile but defiant, preserving humanity one thought at a time. In this way, the prison achieved something singular. It bent the mind almost to breaking, twisted perception and memory, and yet could not entirely erase the human spirit. Madness and memory became entwined, two forces in constant struggle. The victor varied from person to person, but the experience left all changed. Some emerged with clarity sharpened by endurance, others with sanity permanently frayed. Every mind that walked through those halls carried the imprint of the prison, a reminder that captivity's cruelty is measured not only in years or wounds but in the subtle, relentless shaping of thought itself. Every prison has a history, but this one holds secrets that seem to seep from the very stones themselves. Its walls are not merely barriers, but silent witnesses to centuries of suffering, schemes, and unrecorded lives. Each stone, scarred by time and the marks of countless prisoners, tells a story if one knows how to listen. Beneath the surface of official records lies a vast archive of whispered events, hidden rebellions, and the small, tragic moments that never reached the world beyond these walls. The foundation of the prison was laid long before most who enter now could imagine. Built on ancient ground, it absorbed not only the weight of stone but the legacy of all who had suffered there before. Some corners were said to be cursed, the site of forgotten executions or secret trials. Rumors whispered that certain cells were deliberately placed atop old burial grounds, so that the bones of the dead might lend a quiet but relentless pressure to the living. This historical layering made the prison more than a structure. It became a palimpsest of agony, a place where time accumulated like dust, settling in every corner. Early records speak of prisoners whose fates were never documented. Men and women disappeared, not due to escape, but under circumstances that remain obscure. Some were taken for secret experiments, others executed silently, leaving only rumors for those left behind. The guards, complicit in maintaining these secrets, often swore oaths of silence. Yet whispers always traveled through the stone corridors. Prisoners pieced together fragments, creating stories to fill the gaps, legends that blended fact and imagination. These whispered histories became as real as any official record, shaping perceptions, fears, and expectations for generations of inmates. Not all stories were tragic, though most carried the weight of sorrow. Some prisoners performed small, quiet acts that left enduring marks, a carved symbol on a cell wall, a note hidden beneath stone, or a song passed down orally through years of confinement. These acts of subtle rebellion became part of the prison's secret history. Though invisible to the outside world, they persisted internally, creating an unseen lineage of resilience. Prisoners, both past and present, could sense the echoes of these acts, inheriting a quiet defiance that persisted despite brutality and despair. The legends of the prison were also shaped by the interactions between prisoners and guards. Some guards, though few, became figures in whispered stories, cruel tyrants whose names were cursed in every corridor, or unexpected allies who subtly aided escape attempts. Prisoners would recount these encounters in hushed tones, preserving them as cautionary tales or sources of inspiration. Over time, these narratives blended with fact and myth, creating a secret oral history that enriched the prison's dark tapestry. Each retelling reinforced the sense that the prison was alive, aware, and responsive to human action. Certain areas of the prison held more significance than others. Hidden chambers, blocked-off corridors, and long-forgotten dungeons became the focus of secret stories. Prisoners spoke of places where shadows moved independently of light, where whispers could be heard without a source, or where prisoners vanished without trace. While some accounts were undoubtedly products of fear and imagination, others carried credible details passed down from those who had endured direct observation. The layering of fact, rumor, and legend created an internal map of the prison that few guards or new inmates could fully comprehend. Some stories told of subtle victories against the system. Prisoners who hid food, secret letters, or tools created small, almost invisible ripples of resistance. These acts, while minor in scale, became legendary within the internal lore of the prison. A hidden tool could facilitate escape, a message could preserve family ties, and a song could inspire hope. The prison's history, when read through these whispers, reveals not only suffering, but ingenuity and survival. Every stone, every corridor, becomes a record of the invisible struggle between oppression and the human will. The deeper history of the prison also includes the unspoken and morally complex acts of prisoners forced into impossible decisions. Some were coerced into betraying others, leading to fatal consequences. Some were compelled to participate in acts of violence against fellow inmates. These stories, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and fear, shaped both collective memory and personal identity. Though rarely documented, they persist in the mental landscapes of those who endured, influencing interactions and alliances long after the acts themselves occurred. Time itself contributes to the prison's secret history. Decades accumulate slowly, but with every passing year, new layers of memory and legend attach to the structure. Guards rotate, prisoners arrive and depart, but the experiences persist, embedding themselves into the very walls. The prison becomes a repository of countless small histories, overlapping, interwoven, and often contradictory. To walk its corridors is to step through centuries of human experience, where every shadow, creaking floorboard, and carved mark has a story waiting to be discovered by those who listen carefully. Even rituals within the prison contribute to its layered history. Daily routines, punishments, and ceremonies, though designed to impose control, have left traces in memory and legend. Prisoners remember not only the physical acts but the emotional landscapes they created. The silence before punishment, the murmured prayers, and the subtle signals of solidarity all became threads in the hidden narrative of the institution. These rituals, repeated countless times over the years, transformed mundane acts into enduring stories that survive long after the participants themselves have vanished. Some of the most poignant histories are those of forgotten relationships. Prisoners formed connections in silence, friendships, mentorships, familial bonds, often fleeting yet intensely significant. These bonds left traces in stories whispered across generations, a note left under a floorboard, a carved heart in stone, or a secret signal passed in darkness. Though the world outside might never know, inside the prison, these small acts of humanity were preserved in memory, becoming part of the structure's secret chronicle. The cumulative effect of these hidden stories is profound. While official records might portray the prison as a simple institution of law or punishment, its true history is far more intricate. It encompasses cruelty and resilience, despair and ingenuity, secrecy and revelation. Every prisoner contributes, knowingly or unknowingly, to this archive, adding layers of experience, observation, and emotion to the walls, floors, and ceilings. The prison becomes not just a place of confinement, but a living historical document, rich with tales that defy official narrative. Within the prison, whispers of escape circulated endlessly, a tantalizing mix of hope and fear. The architecture itself seemed designed to tease the imagination, presenting narrow corridors, hidden alcoves, and shadowed corners that might, in theory, conceal a path to freedom. Prisoners dreamt of the world beyond the walls, the sun on their faces, the wind in their hair, the taste of water untouched by despair. Yet for all their ingenuity, cunning, and courage, escape remained almost impossibly out of reach, a cruel mirage in the desert of confinement. Some attempts were naive, born of desperation rather than planning. A prisoner might try to squeeze through a narrow grate, scale a wall with makeshift ropes, or conceal themselves in a supply cart. These efforts, though brave, were quickly discovered. Guards, trained to notice even the smallest irregularity, intercepted every such attempt. Punishments followed immediately, designed not merely to deter, but to serve as a spectacle of consequence. Word of these failures spread rapidly, a grim lesson for others, and a reinforcement of the prison's reputation for inescapability. Other attempts were painstakingly planned, extending over weeks or months. Small groups of prisoners would gather secretly, exchanging information and materials in near-total darkness. They observed guards' movements, mapped the layout of the prison, and tested the limits of the walls and doors. Every whisper, glance, or mark could carry vital information. Yet even the most meticulously crafted plans were vulnerable to chance. A misstep, an unexpected patrol, or a misjudged timing could unravel months of preparation in an instant, leaving participants exposed to the full force of the prison's wrath. Psychological pressure played a critical role in thwarting escapes. The constant surveillance, combined with isolation and deprivation, eroded patience and focus. Prisoners who were otherwise clever or courageous often made errors simply because their minds were overtaxed. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and the omnipresent fear of punishment made it nearly impossible to execute complex strategies. Even the strongest mental faculties were weakened, leaving plans fragile and easily broken. In many cases, prisoners sabotaged themselves simply by succumbing to fear or exhaustion at the crucial moment. The consequences of failure were swift and brutal. Some prisoners were returned to their cells, exhausted and humiliated, yet spared physical harm. Others were subjected to public beatings, chained in uncomfortable positions, or forced to witness the punishment of comrades. Occasionally, the punishment extended to death, executed in a manner designed to instill terror. Each failed attempt reinforced the prison's control, demonstrating the futility of resistance and the high cost of daring to challenge its authority. Fear spread quickly, a chilling reminder to all that freedom was not only distant but potentially lethal. Yet even in failure, prisoners learned lessons. Every thwarted attempt provided information: which guards were observant, which doors were more secure than they appeared, which routines could be predicted. These lessons, while costly, contributed to a subtle evolution of strategy, a gradual refinement of understanding that the prison's defenses, though formidable, were not entirely inscrutable. Small victories of insight, however temporary, kept hope alive and preserved a measure of agency, even amid repeated defeat. Sometimes, failure itself became a story, whispered from cell to cell. Prisoners recounted the attempt with a mixture of awe and caution, memorializing both courage and miscalculation. These narratives carried lessons for others, teaching not only technical knowledge but emotional awareness: how to recognize fear, how to manage panic, how to gauge the unpredictable behavior of guards. Even when plans collapsed, the effort was not entirely wasted. It shaped the collective memory of resistance, enriching the secret culture of the prison with strategies, warnings, and cautionary tales. The physical structure of the prison contributed as much to the failure of escapes as the vigilance of guards. Narrow hallways twisted like mazes, staircases led to dead ends, and hidden passages were often traps rather than exits. Even those who discovered a potential escape route found themselves confronted with new obstacles: locked gates, spikes, deep pits, or false corridors. The architecture was not accidental, it was a deliberate tool of psychological warfare. Each obstacle served to disorient, frustrate, and reinforce the perception that escape was impossible. Over time, prisoners internalized this message, and even their imagination began to align with the prison's design, limiting their perception of what was achievable. Social dynamics within the prison also complicated escape attempts. Trust was fragile, alliances fleeting. A single betrayal, whether motivated by fear, coercion, or self-preservation, could ruin months of careful planning. Some prisoners were coerced by guards into informing on comrades, while others capitulated under the threat of punishment. The interpersonal web of the prison, always tense and unpredictable, ensured that collective action was both difficult and dangerous. Cooperation, while necessary for escape, was almost always shadowed by suspicion and fear. Some attempted escapes involved deception rather than brute force. Prisoners would feign compliance, mislead guards, or exploit routines to create temporary opportunities. Even these strategies were fraught with risk. The margin for error was infinitesimal. Discovery often led to harsher consequences than simple physical escape attempts. The psychological tension was immense. Each step of deception required vigilance, cunning, and nerves of steel. Yet, despite careful planning, the prison's combination of structural, social, and psychological control almost always ensured failure. The aftermath of failed escapes extended beyond punishment to a subtle reshaping of behavior. Prisoners often became more cautious, more silent, and more attuned to the environment. Fear became a constant companion, sharpening observation but also reinforcing paralysis. The prison, through repeated cycles of hope and failure, taught its inmates the limits of defiance. Resistance became calculated, measured, and often secretive, limited to minor acts of survival rather than dramatic attempts at freedom. The lessons were harsh but effective, the cost of audacity was high, and the consequences echoed in the minds of all. Even years later, failed escape attempts contributed to the prison's legend. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and tragedy were passed down, blending fact and imagination. These narratives shaped the collective consciousness, embedding the futility and danger of flight into the prison's culture. New prisoners learned from these accounts, internalizing warnings, assessing risks, and understanding the almost mythical difficulty of freedom. The prison's secret history grew richer with each attempt, weaving individual acts into a tapestry of collective experience. Ultimately, the repeated failure of escape reinforced the prison's power. It was not merely a matter of walls or guards, but a systemic orchestration of physical, psychological, and social control. Each thwarted attempt demonstrated the institution's mastery over human ingenuity and courage. Yet, paradoxically, these failures also underscored the enduring human desire for freedom. Even when defeated, prisoners continued to dream, to plan, and to hope. The impossibility of escape became a defining feature, intensifying the terror and the legend of the prison while highlighting the resilience of those confined within. In this way, the prison's control was absolute in practice but never total in spirit. The minds of the incarcerated were tested to the limits, their courage measured against an unyielding system. Each failed escape was both a testament to the prison's design and a reflection of the enduring spark of human will. In the balance between oppression and defiance, the prison maintained its dominion, yet the prisoner's dreams of freedom, however unrealized, remained a quiet but persistent force within the shadowed halls. And so, the story of escape that never came becomes part of the prison's legend. It is a chronicle of courage, miscalculation, and the relentless weight of consequence. It reminds all who enter that while the mind may dream of freedom, the institution itself has designed every mechanism to prevent it. The lessons are seared into memory, whispered in shadows, and remembered in the silence of cells, that hope, though fragile, persists even in the face of inevitability, and that every failure, though bitter, preserves the story of human resistance. The prison was not only a place of confinement and suffering, it was also a crucible for stories that blurred the line between fact and legend. Over decades, whispers became narratives, narratives became myths, and myths became inseparable from the very identity of the place. These tales haunted generations of prisoners, guards, and even local villagers, embedding a sense of dread and wonder that persisted long after the original events had faded. Within the walls, every shadow seemed alive, every corridor held secrets, and every stone carried memories that no historian's ledger could capture. Some of the most enduring legends involved the ghosts of prisoners who had died under mysterious circumstances. Accounts told of figures seen moving silently in the dead of night, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Some claimed to hear footsteps echoing in empty corridors, whispers calling names, or faint weeping that could not be traced to any source. These tales, whether true or imagined, spread fear and awe. Prisoners reported that even the strongest men would hesitate when passing certain cells, convinced that unseen eyes followed their every movement. The legends became a psychological force, shaping behavior as effectively as any guard or chain. Other myths concerned secret passages and hidden rooms. Stories of tunnels beneath the prison, once used for clandestine escapes or forgotten executions, captured the imagination. Prisoners spoke in hushed tones about doors that appeared at odd angles, staircases that led nowhere, and walls that seemed to shift depending on the observer's perspective. Some legends described entire subterranean chambers where prisoners vanished, never to be seen again. While many of these tales were exaggerated, they persisted because they fed a vital psychological need, the possibility, however remote, that escape or revelation was still possible. The prison's history of cruelty also gave rise to tales of supernatural punishment. Rumors suggested that some guards were not entirely human, that they drew strength from fear itself. Some prisoners believed that certain cells were cursed, amplifying pain and despair beyond ordinary measures. Stories told of individuals who had been driven to madness in mere days, their cries echoing in uninhabited corridors long after they had been removed. Such tales reinforced the prison's mystique, blending terror with the allure of the unknown. They reminded all who entered that this was not just a physical space, but a realm where reality and nightmare intertwined. Myths often merged with real acts of bravery, creating stories that inspired both fear and admiration. Tales of prisoners who had attempted daring escapes, defied guards, or preserved their humanity under impossible conditions became legend. One story recounted a man who carved a hidden passage over months, only to be caught moments before freedom. Another told of a woman who memorized the faces and routines of guards to create a mental map of the prison, a map passed down secretly to others. These stories, though often embellished, kept alive the notion that courage and ingenuity could survive even in the most oppressive environments. Oral tradition played a crucial role in shaping these myths. Prisoners passed stories from cell to cell, whispering warnings, encouragements, and accounts of strange occurrences. Even minor events, an unexplained shadow, a sudden noise, or a fleeting glance, were magnified through retelling. Over time, these anecdotes evolved into full-fledged narratives, blending fact, imagination, and superstition. In this way, the prison became a living archive, not of official records, but of human experience in its rawest, most extreme form. The tales themselves became a mechanism of survival, offering lessons, warnings, and a sense of continuity amid chaos. Some myths focused on the figures of authority within the prison. Certain guards became larger-than-life characters, remembered as tyrants or, occasionally, unlikely allies. Stories depicted them as possessing almost supernatural abilities, a gaze that could detect deception, an intuition that anticipated every prisoner's move, or a cruel ingenuity that surpassed ordinary human capacity. While these accounts were often exaggerated, they served a practical function: to instill caution, respect, and fear. The legends became a psychological extension of the prison's control, operating even when the guard himself was absent. Certain cells gained reputations that transcended generations. A particular corner cell, for example, was said to induce madness in even the strongest-willed prisoners within weeks. Another cell was rumored to be the site of secret executions, its walls bearing invisible marks of history. New inmates were often warned, sometimes through subtle gestures or whispered stories, about these locations. The fear associated with these cells was both real and imagined, demonstrating the power of narrative to influence perception and behavior. Even the most rational prisoners found themselves hesitating, questioning their senses, and imagining horrors that may not have existed. Legends also arose from the prison's interactions with the outside world. Smuggled letters, brief visits from family, or conversations with outsiders became fertile ground for myth-making. A small act, such as a secret gift or a coded message, might be remembered as miraculous, a sign of hope or divine intervention. Over time, these stories grew in scale and detail, forming a collective memory that extended beyond the prison walls. Villagers, historians, and former prisoners all contributed to the web of myth, ensuring that the prison's reputation persisted across generations. Religious and spiritual beliefs intertwined with the prison's legends. Some prisoners believed that certain rituals, prayers, or offerings could ward off evil or protect against punishment. Others interpreted unusual events as signs from higher powers, guiding or warning them. These beliefs added layers of meaning to everyday survival, shaping behavior and influencing how prisoners interacted with one another. Even the most skeptical inmates could not ignore the psychological impact of shared spiritual narratives, which reinforced communal identity and a sense of purpose within the oppressive environment. The prison did not end at its stone walls. Its influence extended far beyond the immediate confines of cells, corridors, and guard towers, seeping into the minds of those who lived and worked within, as well as into the consciousness of those who heard its stories from a distance. Fear, carefully cultivated and endlessly reinforced, became its enduring legacy. Even decades after the last prisoner walked its halls, the prison's aura of dread persisted, shaping behavior, memory, and culture in ways both subtle and profound. Those who survived its confines often carried scars that could not be seen, impressions left on the mind as deeply as any bruise or scar on the body. Anxiety, hypervigilance, and mistrust followed them beyond the gates. Some could never sleep without imagining the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, the metallic clang of doors locking, or the watchful eyes of guards observing from unseen corners. Memories of shadows that moved independently, whispers in the dark, and fleeting apparitions became permanent features of perception. For many, the mind remained a prison long after the physical walls had been left behind. The fear extended to families and communities as well. Stories of the prison's cruelty were told and retold, often with embellishment, reinforcing its power and mystery. Parents warned children about obedience and vigilance, using the prison as a symbol of ultimate consequences for defiance. Villagers nearby avoided the area, reluctant to pass even along distant roads, believing in curses, restless spirits, or lingering punishment. In this way, the prison's psychological reach stretched beyond its occupants, embedding itself in social consciousness and local culture. Cultural memory preserved the prison as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience. Legends, myths, and first-hand accounts were compiled orally and later recorded, ensuring that the stories of suffering and endurance endured. Plays, novels, and local folklore drew upon the prison's dark reputation, transforming it into a symbol of ultimate human testing. In these cultural forms, the prison became a mirror reflecting both the depths of cruelty and the heights of human endurance, capturing the imagination of generations who would never see its walls firsthand. The guards themselves carried a legacy, though of a different sort. Some left with shame, haunted by their participation in acts of cruelty, aware that the psychological damage inflicted would outlast the tenure of their service. Others departed with pride, recounting tales of control, dominance, and survival, reinforcing the culture of fear they had helped sustain. Both groups contributed to the prison's enduring reputation, shaping how stories were told and remembered long after their physical presence was gone. Prisoners who returned to the outside world often struggled to reintegrate. Ordinary interactions were shadowed by a constant wariness, a sense that danger could lurk in the most mundane settings. Trust became a scarce commodity, and relationships were difficult to maintain. Some turned to storytelling as a means of processing trauma, sharing both warnings and lessons learned, perpetuating the prison's influence on collective memory. In this way, personal survival intertwined with cultural survival, each story reinforced the legacy of fear and endurance, teaching new generations about both danger and resilience. The architecture itself contributed to the lasting legacy. Visitors, historians, and former prisoners described the building in ways that highlighted its oppressive design: high walls that seemed to loom over the mind as much as the body, narrow corridors that twisted perception, and cells engineered to enforce isolation and despair. Even in ruins, the structure conveyed the same sense of control and omnipresent power. Those who encountered it could sense, without explanation, the weight of countless human lives compressed into a single space. In this way, the prison became more than a building. It became a symbol, a physical manifestation of fear, control, and the human struggle for autonomy. Psychologically, the prison left imprints that were transmitted across generations. Children of former inmates sometimes exhibited inherited patterns of anxiety, hypervigilance, or suspicion, shaped by the environment their parents had endured. Oral history served as both education and warning, creating a network of learned caution. In this sense, the prison's impact was multi-generational, shaping not only those who lived through it but also their descendants, long after the immediate horrors had passed. The prison also became a point of fascination, a place where curiosity and dread coexisted. Scholars, writers, and thrill-seekers were drawn to its stories, eager to understand both its history and the human behavior it produced. Tours and books, documentaries, and essays all contributed to its mythos, ensuring that the prison's psychological shadow extended well beyond physical confinement. Its reputation was reinforced by the interplay of real events and legendary accounts, each amplifying the other, ensuring that the terror and fascination persisted in equal measure. The legacy of fear was carefully entwined with lessons in obedience, resilience, and caution. Stories emphasized the consequences of disobedience, the fragility of freedom, and the unpredictability of human cruelty. Yet they also highlighted the capacity for endurance, ingenuity, and quiet defiance. Through these dual narratives, the prison shaped both moral understanding and psychological expectation, teaching that human beings are capable of both extreme suffering and remarkable survival. Even in contemporary analysis, the prison serves as a case study in the long-term effects of confinement. Psychologists, historians, and sociologists examine how isolation, deprivation, and extreme control shape the mind. The lessons drawn extend far beyond the walls themselves, informing modern understanding of trauma, resilience, and the impact of systemic oppression. In this sense, the prison's legacy continues to influence both thought and practice, bridging past and present through the ongoing study of fear and survival. In literature and media, the prison appears as a timeless archetype, the ultimate testing ground, the symbol of extreme adversity, and a mirror of the human psyche under pressure. Writers draw upon its legends and history, blending horror with heroism, despair with hope. Through these stories, the prison continues to educate and captivate, extending its psychological and cultural influence to audiences who may never physically encounter its walls. Its lessons persist, carried by imagination and memory, ensuring that the fear and endurance it engendered remain part of the collective consciousness. The final legacy of the prison is perhaps the most enduring, the reminder that fear, control, and trauma are not confined to walls and cells but can ripple outward, affecting minds, communities, and cultures long after the physical structures are gone. Yet alongside this legacy of terror exists the equally powerful legacy of resilience, courage, and the human capacity to endure. Within the echoes of corridors, the whispers of ghosts, and the stories of those who survived, the prison teaches that the human spirit can survive even when the body is confined, and that memory, myth, and storytelling can preserve both horror and heroism for generations to come. And so, the prison lives on, not only as a physical space but as a profound psychological and cultural force. Its lessons resonate in whispers, legends, and memories, reminding us that fear can shape minds, that cruelty leaves lasting imprints, and that endurance is one of humanity's most powerful and enduring traits. The walls may crumble, the guards may leave, and the prisoners may pass on, but the legacy of fear, survival, and story endures, a haunting testament to the power of confinement and the resilience of the human soul.